I can understand how God creates concrete objects, things. But what is interesting to me, maybe more interesting, are abstract notions, necessary truths of logic, mathematics, 2 + 2 = 4, things that seem to be true no matter what and almost impossible to create because they are necessary abstract things. Help me to understand this.
Well, I think you've put your finger here on one of the oldest and most arcane metaphysical disputes among philosophers that there is, and that is whether or not there is a realm of abstract entities in addition to the concrete entities that we all know and love. On the one hand, it's difficult even to know what an abstract object is. We're familiar with concrete objects, things that exist in space and time, but abstract objects would be something quite different than that. They don't have spatiotemporal relations with things in most cases. So,
what are some examples?
Well, examples would be things like the number 3, for example. Do you think that there is a thing called 3? That 3 actually exists? And I'm not talking about the numeral 3, which is a mark on a piece of paper. That clearly exists.
There are a lot of examples, exemplification of this concept.
Yes.
A lot of particulars.
Yes, a lot of particulars. And these we would typically call numerals. But does the number 3 exist? Is there something called 3 that is a part of reality? And are there other numbers? And are there sets of numbers and functions and other mathematical entities?
Logical relationships.
These things would typically stand in logical relationships. For example, 3 is the square root of 9. And that would seem to be a necessary relationship in which these abstract objects, if they exist, stand. So, the question is, are there such things as these abstract objects? And what are they if they exist? Typically, the realm of abstract objects would be defined as objects which do not stand in any causal relations with anything else. The number 3, if it exists, doesn't cause anything. It has no causal effect on any other thing. If these abstract objects exist, they would be causally effete or impotent. And that would seem to be definitive of what an abstract object is. Anything that does not or cannot stand in a causal relationship would be an abstract object if it exists.
How does this help me understand whether God created it or didn't?
Well, in this way, many of these abstract objects, if they exist, would seem to exist necessarily. The number 3 doesn't seem to be a contingent object. It would seem to be necessary in its being.
And that God, if God didn't create it, it would still have to be.
Exactly.
And you couldn't go from God creating 2 and then 4 and just never created 3.
Well, not if you're what is called a Platonist. A Platonist is named after the Greek philosopher Plato, who believed in a realm of forms or abstract objects like this. And Platonists would say that numbers are not created by human beings thinking of them in our minds, but that numbers exist necessarily, and so do sets and other mathematical objects. Now, it seems to me that that kind of Platonism is inherently incompatible with the Judeo-Christian faith, which conceives of God as the creator of all reality outside of himself.
So that means if you have these abstract objects, numbers, existing necessarily, meaning that God didn't create them, that is detrimental to the fundamental concept of the Judeo-Christian God.
Right. It would be incompatible with the Judeo-Christian concept of God, which thinks of God as uniquely self-existent. God is the only self-existent being.
So now if we have something else that's self-existent, then God is just one of an innumerable number of abstract or something things, and just God is part of this panoply.
You said it exactly right. It would literally be innumerable. Infinities of infinities of infinities.
Of things.
Of things that exist all independently of God, so that it leads to a kind of metaphysical pluralism that reduces God to an infinitesimal part of reality,
Just
most of
creating
which is totally independent of him.
So all God would be doing is creating the concrete objects, which is a tiny fraction of all these other things.
Just an infinitesimal part of reality would be due to God's creative activity. Most realms of being would exist necessarily and independently of God, which compromises both God's self-existence and also his creation of everything else out of nothing. It would mean, in fact, that most things are not created.
And also his freedom, because then he hasn't been free to create or not create these.
Well, I think that does seem to follow, because it would mean God is not free to refrain from creation and simply exist alone. It would mean that God necessarily has lots of company out there.
And God himself would be just one of this innumerable number of things that exist forever and necessarily.
Right, he would just be one among many, and there wouldn't be any ultimate unifying metaphysical source of reality.
So, as a Christian theist, you got a problem.
Right.
What are you going to do about it?
Well, I remember when I first encountered this issue, it struck me deeply. I thought, this is a dagger at the heart of my faith in God. This is a serious objection that I had never encountered before. And so I began to read and study on this area, and it seems to me that there are three possible responses that the Christian or Jewish monotheist might make to this problem. The simplest and most obvious would be a sort of absolute creationism, which would try to marry Platonism with traditional theism and creation by saying, well, these things don't exist necessarily after all. They are created by God. God created all of the numbers and the abstract objects and so forth.
And yet, for us, it's hard to believe how you can have existence without them.
Yes, now,
they seem indispensable.
That's true, although there are some purely secular philosophers who believe that numbers, if they exist contingently. And one could say that they exist eternally, but that they are eternally created by God in the sense of conserved in being by God. There, the doctrine of conservation might come into play. You could say God never brought the numbers into being, but nevertheless they depend on him for their existence, a kind of absolute creationism. You could finesse this different ways, but the basic insight would be to try to preserve the reality of these objects external to God, but make them created entities. That would be this absolute creationism. Right. Now, an alternative view would be what's called fictionalism, which would say that, in fact, there aren't any such entities as these abstract objects. These are just useful fictions that we use to organize the world. But in fact, there really is no such thing as the number 3.
So it's a human imposition on the world?
Well, it would be a way of speaking about the world that is convenient, but shouldn't be construed literally. So, for example, when I say something like this, there are differences between Republicans and Democrats, I don't mean to be committing myself to the existence of something called differences, which exist out in the world, that there are really things that we call differences. When I say there are differences between Republicans and Democrats, I don't mean to be committing myself to some object called differences. What I mean could be paraphrased away by saying Republicans and Democrats differ. And you see, that paraphrase then would reveal I'm not committing myself to this new ontological category called differences. And in the same way, one might say mathematical talk and talk of other abstract objects is just a way of talking about the real world of concrete objects, and it's not meant to be construed literally. This is just useful fictions.
And therefore it's not a problem.
And therefore it's not a problem, because these things don't really exist.
Okay. What's the third?
The third way would be what is called conceptualism. And this would be to move the realm of abstract objects out of the external world into God's mind as ideas or concepts of God. This was St. Augustine's move. He was trained in Platonic thought, but realized that this realm of independently existing abstract objects was incompatible with theism, so he moved them into the mind of God. He said the Platonic realm of the forms or the ideas are God's ideas. And so numbers are concepts in God's mind, and properties would be concepts that God has. Propositions might be God's thoughts that are either true or false. So conceptualism would say there is no realm of external abstract objects, but nevertheless, they're not just fictions. They do exist, but they exist as ideas in God's mind. So these would be three alternatives, and I think the question is which of these alternatives provides the best account of God and abstract objects?
And they are very different. Do you find it a critical question for a Christian theist?
Well, I think this question is absolutely critical, Robert. As I said, I think that it's incompatible with the traditional Judeo-Christian faith to have this Platonistic view of reality. And yet many philosophers and many mathematicians today are Platonists about these mathematical and other abstract structures. And so I think that this is just imperative that we think through this very difficult subject in a deep way and come to some sort of resolution. And I think these are the three broad alternatives that are out there for us to explore.
And your conclusion, using any one of those three, is that God is the ultimate creator and and his existence is different than the existence of these objects.
Yes, each of the three would provide a theologically acceptable way of discussing abstract objects that would leave God as uniquely self-existent and the creator of all reality outside himself.